Marcus Webb had been a park security guard for 11 years, and he knew Sycamore Lake like he knew his own bedroom. Every corner of the lakefront, every dock, every access road, every place where people gathered on weekends or weekdays or the rare quiet afternoons when nobody came at all. He worked the evening shift mostly, 4 p.m. to midnight, checking permits, making sure the facilities were locked, watching for trouble. On April 15th, 2011, a Friday evening in spring, Marcus was doing his routine walk around the perimeter when he noticed something unusual. A young woman had come to rent a kayak at 6:15 p.m., which was late for a rental. The sun was already low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the water. She was alone. She was wearing jeans and a sweater, not typical kayaking clothes. She seemed distressed, distant, as though her mind was somewhere far away from the lake. The woman renting the kayak to her, a college student named Jenny, who worked part-time at the rental shack, remembered being surprised by the booking. The girl had paid cash, no credit card. She'd signed the liability waiver without reading it, without even glancing at the words. Jenny had tried to make conversation, asking where the girl was from, what she studied, making the kind of small talk that rental staff made with customers. But the girl had given one-word answers, had avoided eye contact. Jenny remembered thinking that something was off. The girl had launched the kayak toward the center of the lake, heading northwest, away from the main beach area where other people were still enjoying the last hours of daylight. Marcus watched her go, watched the kayak move across the water with deliberate strokes, powerful and purposeful. He thought about calling her back, asking if she was okay, if she needed anything. Something felt off about her demeanor, about the way she gripped the paddle, about the set of her shoulders. But she was an adult. She'd signed the paperwork. She had a life jacket. It wasn't his job to question every decision people made. He made a note in the logbook, time 6:15 p.m., single occupant, kayak number 7. He never saw her again. By 11 p.m. that night, when Marcus left for the day, the kayak had not been returned. He flagged it in the system and called the rental company manager, Tom. Tom said they'd wait until morning. If it wasn't back by opening time, they'd start making calls. But morning came, and the kayak still hadn't been returned. The rental company called the sheriff's office. The sheriff's office called the university, because the young woman's ID and phone were registered to that institution. The university's student services office identified her as Sarah Chen, 19 years old, sophomore, computer science major. Her parents lived in San Jose, 2 hours away. Her roommate, a girl named Ashley, said Sarah had gone out Friday evening and hadn't come back. She didn't have any classes on Saturday. They'd assumed she was staying with friends somewhere else on campus or in town. When the police called the parents, Sarah's mother dropped everything and drove to the lake, arriving by late afternoon. The police searched the water with boats and divers. They found kayak number 7 the next morning, floating empty, drifting near the north shore about half a mile from where she'd launched. But Sarah was not in the kayak. There was no body, no sign of a struggle. Sarah's backpack was not in the kayak. Her shoes were not there. The seat was dry on top. It was as if the kayak had been abandoned and left to drift or deliberately set loose. The initial investigation lasted for 2 years. Detectives from the county sheriff's office interviewed everyone connected to Sarah's life. They talked to Ashley, her roommate, who said Sarah had been increasingly withdrawn over the previous month. She'd stopped going to the dining hall for meals. She'd started eating alone in the room, ordering food delivery, or eating snacks from her desk. She'd been spending hours on her laptop, working on computer science projects, or just browsing the internet late into the night. The roommate couldn't say she'd noticed anything specifically alarming, but there was a sense of Sarah pulling away, becoming isolated, retreating into herself. They interviewed Sarah's professors. All of them said she was a bright student, engaged in class discussions, asking good questions about algorithms and data structures and software design. None of them reported any signs of crisis or emergency. They interviewed Sarah's friends from the computer science club. Her friends said Sarah was quiet but seemed okay. Most of the time, she went to club meetings regularly. She participated in coding competitions and hackathons. She had a boyfriend briefly, a senior named Kevin, but they'd broken up around March, just a few weeks before her disappearance. The relationship had been casual. Her friends said, nothing serious. Sarah had seemed fine about the breakup, or at least she'd said she was fine, though one friend mentioned that Sarah had seemed quieter after the breakup than before. Detectives obtained Sarah's psychological evaluation from the university's counseling center. Sarah had been seeing a therapist, Dr. Michael Torres, once a week for about 3 months before her disappearance. The therapist could not discuss the specifics of their sessions due to confidentiality restrictions, but he confirmed that Sarah had been seeking help. He said she was dealing with anxiety and some depressive symptoms. Nothing in their sessions had suggested she was an imminent suicide risk, but he acknowledged that suicide risk assessments were imperfect tools. People could hide their intentions very effectively. Sarah had been functioning well on the surface. She was attending school regularly. She was eating. She was going to classes and getting decent grades. From the outside, she appeared to be engaged with treatment and working through her issues in a healthy way. The therapist expressed shock at the possibility that Sarah might have intentionally ended her life. Jenny, the rental shack worker, was interviewed by police. She remembered the encounter with Sarah vividly. She said that in her year of working at the rental shack, she developed an intuition about people, about who seemed safe and who seemed troubled. She said Sarah had seemed troubled. When Jenny reviewed her memory of that evening, she realized she'd noticed several things. Sarah's hands were trembling slightly. She'd asked about the depth of the lake, a question Jenny found odd. She'd asked whether bodies floated in lakes, whether someone falling in during the evening would be found quickly. Jenny had thought the questions were just nervous chatter from a first-time kayaker. Now she realized they might have meant something else entirely. Jenny felt guilt about not flagging the encounter, not calling Marcus over, not finding a way to stop Sarah from going out on the water. The police obtained Sarah's social media accounts with a warrant. Her Instagram showed photos of her at the university, at the lake in sunnier days, at a coffee shop with friends smiling at the camera. Her Twitter had very few posts, mostly retweets of computer science and technology articles from industry leaders. Her Facebook was similarly sparse. There were no obvious warning signs in the digital record, no posts about death or suicide, no dramatic expressions of hopelessness or despair. In fact, Sarah's last post on Instagram, dated April 14, 2011, the day before her disappearance, was a photograph of a sunset from the university library, the sky painted in orange and pink, the light golden and warm, captioned simply, "Golden Hour." It was a mundane, almost cheerful post. There was nothing in her digital footprint that suggested she was in crisis or contemplating ending her life. After 2 years, with no new leads and no body, the case was classified as cold. Sarah was technically still a missing person, but the investigation went dormant. She remained frozen at 19, stuck in the spring of 2011, while the world moved forward. Her parents created a missing persons poster that was distributed regionally, but as years passed, the posters faded and weathered in the sun and rain. The story of Sarah Chen became less urgent. New missing persons cases captured media attention. Sarah's case was archived, filed away, relegated to cold case databases and online forums for people interested in unsolved mysteries. The lake became just a lake again, a place where people had fun and made memories, not a place where a girl had disappeared. 9 years passed. Sarah Chen remained missing. The case had gone cold. After 2 years of investigation, her parents moved to different cities, unable to bear living in California with the constant reminder of their daughter's absence. The university created a memorial scholarship, the Sarah Chen Computer Science Award, given annually to a deserving student who showed excellence in coding and perseverance through personal challenges. News articles about Sarah disappeared from local archives. The lake continued to be a place where people rented kayaks, rode paddleboards, had picnics, got married on the dock. Nobody new came to the lake specifically, thinking about Sarah Chen. She became a ghost story told occasionally by longtime residents, a cautionary tale about a girl who vanished on a Friday evening in the spring of 2011 and was never found. Then in August 2020, a summer festival was being prepared at Sycamore Lake. The county was setting up for a large outdoor celebration, with vendors and entertainment stages and decorative balloons scattered everywhere. A maintenance crew was doing preliminary landscape work near the North Shore, in an area of the lake that wasn't heavily visited, mostly just dense trees and rocky ground. They were clearing fallen branches and debris when one of the workers, a man named David Torres, noticed something caught in a tangle of tree roots at the water's edge. It was a balloon. Not a fresh balloon clearly, but an old one, faded and dull, probably having been in the water and washed up on shore repeatedly. It was a standard party balloon, the kind you'd buy at a grocery store for a child's birthday. The color possibly purple or magenta originally, now bleached to a pale gray by years of sun and water exposure. But attached to the balloon, tied with a waterlogged string that had somehow held despite years of exposure, was a plastic bag. Inside the plastic bag was a photograph protected by layers of clear plastic and sealed with duct tape. The photograph showed a young woman's face, smiling, with her name written on the back in pen, Sarah Chen. Next to the balloon were other items caught in the same root tangle: a waterproof envelope containing what looked like a handwritten note, a small wooden box sealed with waterproof tape, a flip-flop, faded by sun and water, size 7, a child's toy, a small plastic figurine, also waterlogged and barely recognizable, a bundle of letters tied with ribbon, also encased in waterproof plastic. The discovery was reported to the sheriff's office immediately. Sheriff's Detective Lisa Morales arrived at the scene within an hour. She looked at the balloon, the photograph, the note with careful attention. Something about the arrangement seemed deliberate, not accidental. Items don't typically accumulate in exactly the same spot by chance over 9 years. They don't stay bound together by a string, unless something is holding them there intentionally. Detective Morales ordered the area cordoned off. She photographed everything from multiple angles with professional equipment. She called for forensic specialists from the state lab. She reached out to the original investigator on the Sarah Chen case, a retired detective named Robert Patterson, and asked him to consult on this new development. Patterson drove to the lake the same afternoon. He was 72 years old, had been retired for 7 years, but he remembered Sarah Chen's case vividly. He remembered her parents' anguish and desperation. He remembered the empty kayak drifting on the water. He remembered the feeling of knowing that something was profoundly wrong, but having no evidence of what that something was. When he saw the balloon, the photograph, the items arranged in the roots, he said something immediately that made Detective Morales stop and listen carefully. He said, "This is a message. Somebody put this here." Patterson's instinct was based on decades of investigative experience. Objects found in water could certainly be accidental, dislodged by waves or currents, but the arrangement was too neat, too intentional. The plastic bag protecting the photograph was too deliberately sealed. The balloon was too prominent, too visible if you were working in the area. Somebody wanted this to be found. The handwritten note was the key piece of evidence. Detective Morales carefully opened the waterproof envelope and examined the note under forensic lighting. The writing was in blue pen, the ink still legible after 9 years in water-resistant plastic. The note said, "My name is Sarah Chen. I am 19 years old. I rented a kayak on April 15th, 2011. I am leaving this message in case something happens to me. If you are reading this, it means I did not make it back. Please tell my parents I love them. Please tell them this was my choice. I could not keep living the way I was living. I am sorry. I have tried to explain in the letters. Please read them. Please forgive me." The note was dated April 15th, 2011, the same date as Sarah's disappearance. But the note raised immediate questions. The handwriting needed to be verified. The psychological state that prompted the note needed to be understood. And most crucially, if Sarah had decided to end her life, where was her body? Detective Morales contacted Sarah's parents for the first time in 9 years. They were devastated by the news. They had spent 9 years hoping their daughter was alive somewhere, had been kidnapped perhaps, or had lost her memory, or had chosen to disappear to start a new life somewhere. The note destroyed that hope, while simultaneously providing a terrible kind of closure. The mother wept uncontrollably. The father became silent and withdrawn. They flew to California and provided handwriting samples from Sarah's journals, letters, and schoolwork to forensic analysts. Forensic handwriting analysis confirmed that the note was written by Sarah Chen. The ink, the paper, the pressure patterns, all consistent with known samples of her writing from 2011. The analysis showed no signs of forging or mimicry. This was genuinely Sarah's handwriting, written when she was 19 years old, 9 years before it was discovered in the lake. But the story still wasn't complete. If Sarah had written the note with the intention of ending her life, how had it survived 9 years in the lake? How had the balloon and the items all stayed together? How had they remained in that specific tangle of roots, where they would eventually be found? A limnologist, a scientist who studies freshwater lakes and their ecosystems, consulted on the case. Her name was Dr. Patricia Havens, and she had studied Sycamore Lake for 15 years. She explained that the north shore of Sycamore Lake had specific currents that changed seasonally. Water moved in particular patterns based on thermal stratification, wind patterns, and the contours of the lake bottom. Items that were deposited in certain spots could remain there for extended periods, especially if they were weighted or caught in root systems. She suggested that Sarah, if she had planned carefully, could have weighted the plastic bag with rocks and attached it to a balloon that would keep it partially visible at the surface initially. Over 9 years the balloon would have lost air gradually, sinking lower and lower. The root tangle at the north shore was known to catch debris from the water. Items could absolutely remain there for 9 years if the conditions were right. The placement was technically feasible and consistent with lake physics. Dr. Havens also explained the physical properties of the lake water. Sycamore Lake reached temperatures of around 45 degrees Fahrenheit at 90 feet depth, cold enough to dramatically slow decomposition of organic matter. She theorized that if Sarah's body had sunk to that depth and remained there, it could have been preserved in a relatively intact state, or at least preserved enough that skeletal material would remain recognizable decades later. However, the lake water was also moving, driven by currents and thermal gradients, and bodies could be displaced by these forces over time. It was possible that Sarah's body had been carried to a different location, somewhere deeper, somewhere the search teams had not thoroughly examined 9 years earlier. But there was still no body. This was the central mystery that troubled the investigators. If Sarah had intentionally ended her life in the lake on April 15, 2011, why had she never been found? Sycamore Lake had been searched by divers multiple times in the weeks and months after her disappearance. The searches had been thorough, though not completely exhaustive due to budget and resource limitations. The lake was large, 7 miles around the perimeter, with depths reaching 140 feet in some places. A body decomposing in water would eventually surface, usually within weeks or months due to gases produced by decomposition. But it was also possible, the forensic pathologist suggested, that Sarah's body had never surfaced because of specific water conditions. The lake had deep spots, cold spots, spots where currents could hold a body down for extended periods. It was possible that Sarah was still in the lake, preserved by cold water and depth, never rising to be found. It was also possible that animals had disturbed the body in the early years, scattering remains across the lake floor. With 9 years of potential displacement and scattering, finding all of Sarah's remains would be extremely difficult. The investigation concluded that Sarah Chen had most likely entered the lake with the intention of ending her life on April 15, 2011 at 6:15 p.m. She had left behind a message, packaged it carefully, weighted it so it would remain in the lake but potentially surface or be discovered someday. She had rented the kayak. She had paddled out into the water. She had either fallen or jumped or deliberately capsized the kayak. Her body had not surfaced in the initial search window and had likely remained at depth or been caught by currents and deposited in an area not fully searched. The balloon and message had drifted for 9 years until they became caught in the North Shore root system, where they were discovered during routine maintenance work. This conclusion brought closure to the Chen family, but it also brought immense sadness. Sarah had been suffering in ways nobody had fully recognized. She had been a 19-year-old computer science student with a bright future. She had kept her pain hidden very effectively. Nobody knew she was in crisis. Nobody knew she was planning to end her life. She had simply rented a kayak on a Friday evening and gone into the water, leaving behind a message in a balloon that would only be found years later. But then 3 months after the balloon was discovered, the divers returned to Sycamore Lake for a more extensive search. This time, they knew what they were looking for and where to focus their efforts. They knew Sarah had likely entered the water at marker point 6, which corresponded to where she'd launched the kayak. They searched the deep basin north of that point, the area where currents would have carried her if she'd sunk. On the second day of the new search, at a depth of 93 feet, on the lake bottom in an area of sediment and fallen logs, they found human remains. Skeletal analysis confirmed the bones belonged to Sarah Chen. She had been at the lake bottom for 9 years, preserved by the cold water and depth. She had never surfaced. She had never been found until the divers specifically knew where to look. The remains were not complete, scattered by currents and animal activity, but enough was recovered to make a positive identification using dental records and bone structure analysis. Marcus Webb, the park security guard, who had watched Sarah launch the kayak that evening in 2011, attended her memorial service in 2020. He was 51 years old by then. He had left park security work and taken a job managing facilities at a corporate office building downtown. He still thought about Sarah sometimes. Thought about that Friday evening, when something in her face told him something was wrong. He thought about how he hadn't asked her if she was okay, if something was bothering her, if she needed help. He thought about how a simple question, a moment of connection, might have changed the trajectory of that evening. But he also understood that depression and suicidal ideation were conditions that often couldn't be seen from the outside. A person could appear functional, could show up to school, could interact with others, and still be experiencing profound pain beneath the surface. Sarah's best friend, a woman named Michelle, who had known her since elementary school, spoke at the service. She said Sarah had always been the kind of person who helped others, who listened carefully to their problems, who cared deeply about the people in her life. Michelle said she should have noticed that Sarah wasn't okay, that the withdrawal and isolation were signs of something serious. She said she felt guilty for not checking in more often, for not asking the hard questions about what was really going on in Sarah's mind and heart. There was another element to the case that lingered in the minds of investigators. The note was deliberate. The balloon was deliberate. The packaging, the waterproofing, the placement, all suggested that Sarah had taken considerable time to prepare this message. She had wanted it to be found eventually. The wooden box contained handwritten letters addressed to her parents, her best friend, and her therapist. These letters had not been released to the public. The family requested privacy regarding the contents. Sarah's mother, in a private interview with a journalist months later, said that the letters had helped her understand the depth of Sarah's suffering, but they had also raised new questions that would never be answered. Sarah had written about feeling like she didn't belong, like the world was overwhelming, like her mind was too loud and wouldn't stop. But the letters also contained expressions of love for her parents, deep apologies, and instructions about her funeral and her possessions. It was the work of someone who had thought carefully about the act she was about to commit. The case of Sarah Chen was officially closed in December 2020. Her parents started a suicide prevention foundation in her name, funding mental health programs at colleges and universities. The Sarah Chen Foundation dedicated resources to training college counselors in suicide risk assessment and intervention. They created a scholarship fund that provided mental health support to students struggling with depression and anxiety. Sycamore Lake returned to being a place where people rented kayaks and enjoyed the water on weekends. But for people who knew the story, there was a persistent sadness. A 19-year-old girl had been suffering silently. She had sought help through a therapist, but the help had not been enough. The pain had been too deep. She had made the decision to end her life and had executed that decision with careful planning. 9 years later, she had reached out from the lake bottom, had sent her message in a balloon, and had finally been found. What remains unanswered is the nature of Sarah's specific suffering. Her therapist refused to discuss the contents of her sessions, citing patient confidentiality. Sarah's parents spoke in general terms about depression and anxiety. Her friends said she sometimes seemed overwhelmed but always seemed to recover. From the outside, she appeared to be doing okay, but depression does not announce itself. Sarah had been a person who was smiling on the outside while experiencing crisis on the inside. She had reached out through her therapist and through her academic work, but something in that reach had fallen short. And so on a Friday evening in April, she had rented a kayak, she had paddled out into the water, and she had taken her own life in the deep basin of Sycamore Lake, leaving behind a message that would only surface 9 years later, carried by currents and held by roots, waiting to be discovered. What remains is the question: could Sarah's death have been prevented if someone had recognized her suffering earlier, or if the help available to her had been more intensive, more connected, more able to reach the deepest places of her pain? And what does it mean that she left behind a message in the water, as if she knew that someday, someone would need to understand what happened to her, even though that understanding could not bring her back?